Hello, hello! Welcome to Brenda's Books. In this podcast, I will be sharing with you the books that I write, or have written, usually about one chapter at a time. In this very first season, I will be narrating for you my young adult coming-of-age love story, which is called Blemished Beauty. Now, if you don't think you like romance, by the end of this book, you will love romance. So, without further ado, here is Blemished Beauty by Brenda Hodnett. Here we go. Prologue. Daphne Zollinger shifted with discomfort in her cold metal chair. She rolled her rigid shoulders and circled her stiff neck. The blank walls of the stale clinic room echoed the raw emptiness inside her. "Stop fidgeting, Daphne," said her best friend Laurel, who was sitting in the corner. "Everything will be fine." Daphne wanted to roll her eyes. Easy for you to say. Just then, a dermatologist entered the room after a soft knock at the door. Daphne stared at her with anxious anticipation. Dr. Willow sat in a chair opposite Daphne and crossed her lengthy legs, so her purple skirt hung just lower than her lab coat. Her curly black hair framed her solemn face. She leaned toward Daphne when she spoke. "You have a condition called rosacea. It's a treatable condition, but also a chronic one." Daphne shook her head as if to clear it. "Are you saying I'm going to have this red-colored acne skin for the rest of my life? I'm 22. I thought I would have grown out of this by now." The doctor frowned in understanding. "This is different. Sometimes rosacea can go on through your 40s, even beyond. Each case is different. In the meantime, you will continue to have some flare-ups and remissions, but if we stay on top of your treatments, it can be manageable." "Since when has my skin ever been manageable?" "What are the treatments? I'll give you oral and topical antibiotics. You'll need to manage your stress. It will also help if you stay out of the heat, which shouldn't be a problem this winter." The doctor smiled as if this made everything better. "Will the burning ever go away?" Daphne asked, as she put a subconscious hand up to her cheek. "It shouldn't bother you all the time," Dr. Willow assured her. "Rosacea can affect your eyes, too. Make sure you see an ophthalmologist right away if you notice any swelling." Daphne inhaled deeply. She glanced at Laurel, who continued to sit in silence. She threw a sympathetic look at Daphne. "I'll write you a prescription," the doctor said, standing up. "Don't worry yourself too much over this," she said with a polite smile, and then left the room, closing the door behind her. "Don't worry," Daphne quoted sourly. "Fat chance of that." She stood and walked across the clinic room where a small oval mirror hung on the wall. She peered at her reflection in disgust. Her cheeks were near crimson, scattered with small pimples as were her forehead and chin. "Will I really look like this forever?" "I know what you're thinking," Laurel announced, now standing behind her. She placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It won't be this bad all the time." Daphne glanced at Laurel's reflection. Her light hair was tied back in a high ponytail, and her face was perfect. The smoothest, creamiest complexion one could have. Daphne's cheeks burned all the more as she swallowed hard. If only she could swallow her resentment. Chapter 1. On the Edge. Daphne Zollinger wiped the heavy, wet snow from her goggles. Not that it helped much. Every time she did so, her icy, soggy gloves left streaks on the lenses. Her ski mask was starting to freeze to her face, and every deep breath blurred her vision further. She pressed her hands hard against her ears to warm them. Her head ached as the bitter, icy wind bellowed down the mountain. She adjusted her goggles to get a better look at what lay ahead. A deep sigh made its way through her dry throat. The blinding snow continued to fall furiously from the dark Alaskan sky. Daphne could not keep up with Laurel, an avid skier, on this terrain in such a terrible blizzard. Oh, why did I ever let Laurel talk me into this? This is crazy! Every last inch of her was numb to the bone. She realized her feet no longer had any control over her skis as she collided very clumsily into the trunk of a tree. Her entire body throbbed from the small accident. "Daphne!" shouted a distant, muffled voice. Daphne lifted her head to see Laurel a few yards ahead of her. Laurel looked like a big, puffy strawberry, powdered with sugar from head to toe. "Come on!" Laurel yelled into the blustering air. "We have to move faster if we're going to make it out of here." She then swiftly poked her poles into the ground to spin herself around. Gracefully, she glided across the snow past the thick red cedars, despite the falling sleet and circling wind blowing against her. Ignoring her tired arms, Daphne quickly pricked her poles into the snowy ground to follow her friend. As she gathered sufficient momentum, one of her poles cracked a patch of ice and brought her to a jolting halt. She lost her balance but caught herself before she collapsed. She frowned as she realized the small delay would put her even farther behind Laurel. She could hardly see her anymore. The dreadful snow and wind mercilessly pelted her face. Daphne reached the top of a slope and spotted Laurel at the bottom of it. The hill was quite steep, and Daphne usually would have skied down it with a little caution. However, fear of losing Laurel triggered her to be a bit braver, so she headed straight down without trying to slow herself. Daphne leaned over her knees to put her weight into her toes, keeping her skis together and her poles jutting out behind her. She zoomed down the slope faster and faster. The thrill of such speed coursed through her veins so swiftly she felt as if her heart would leap right out of her chest and fly off with the wind. She felt daring and powerful as she kept her feet and knees in control. Her confidence left as instantly as it had come, however, once she saw the perilous sight in front of her. How it got there, Daphne couldn't imagine. Just beyond an oversized cedar was a cliff. She didn't know how dangerous a cliff it was, and she was suddenly strangled with terror at the thought of how treacherous it could be. Daphne shrieked involuntarily and desperately tried to whip herself around to avoid the drop. In her attempt, she crashed to the ground. She vaguely noticed one of her skis flying through the air. Her poles were no longer in her hands because her fingers were clawing futilely at the icy ground. It was too dark, and she was moving too fast to see anything clearly. Daphne heard screams in the air and wondered if they were her own. Her heart throbbed in her ears as she stared, petrified, at the cliff's edge, skyrocketing toward her. She had to stop herself. Daphne struggled with all her strength to dig the ski that was still attached to her toe into the icy slope, but there was no way of it catching while she was at such a twisted angle. And then she knew she was done for. This was it. This was the end. Unmercifully, the cliff seemed to increase its slippery surface, and Daphne plummeted over the edge, shrieking in panic. Her eyes desperately searched for a branch, a root, anything to grab a hold of. She saw several and grappled at them all, but they immediately slipped from her grasp. Daphne went tumbling down the untamed mountain. Branches and rocks cut her at every move. With each roll of her body, her stubborn ski had an evil mind of its own, and smacked her in the knee, the head, the face. A sudden wrenching tear in her leg lashed through her. She heard herself scream again, and then finally she was still. Tom Moulton was busy hauling some freshly chopped wood into the lean-to shed, adjacent to his 2-bedroom cabin. A blizzard was screaming through the mountains. The black evening sky, which was usually clear and beautiful and scattered with sparkling stars, had quickly turned ominous. He shuddered at the thought of another long winter. Gathering his previous wood together, he turned toward the cabin. Mid-step, he thought he heard yelling off in the distance. What the devil? Out of curiosity, he pointed his flashlight towards the high cliff above him, about a quarter of a mile away. The lofty mountain rose majestically. Massive boulders bulged out of its surface. Giant pines feathered across the tree line, and red cedars plumped at the bottom. Even after all the months he had been here, this impressive beauty still filled him with a sense of wonder and awe. Then he heard it again, that strange screaming. What is going on? Tom used his flashlight to scan the nearby field and woods this time. He saw no one. He shrugged. It was probably his imagination. His long-term solitude might very well be bringing him close to insanity. Tom let out an enormous sigh and continued heaving the chopped wood into organized piles. Still, an eerie feeling crept over him. Was it another fellow hunter who would try to kill him again? Tom shivered as he tossed another log onto the pile. Now the screaming sounded more like a cry, a sad, piercing cry. That's definitely a person. Tom clicked on his light again and walked briskly towards the desperate cries, suddenly quite determined to discover whoever it was. The knee-deep snow was quickly getting even deeper. Tom waded through the snow longer than he had expected. He wasn't worried about getting lost, but the mystery person probably was. He or she would need shelter soon, since the storm was intensifying swiftly. If you're out there, make a sound. I can't see you. It was strange to hear a voice again, even if it were his own. Croaked a voice, followed by a loud, hacking cough. Tom pointed his flashlight toward the sound. He saw a lone figure standing next to what? He quickened his step, but slowed as he moved into deeper snow. Then he saw the object was a ski, standing upright in the snow. A figure was leaning against it. Do you need help? Are you lost? Tom asked, moving closer. Yes, a trembling voice faintly whispered. A girl just a few years younger than Tom. What was she doing out here alone? Well, at least you probably won't try to kill me, I think. Daphne was barely aware she had fainted again, but she figured she must have because she didn't remember this man picking her up. However, at the moment, she was very aware she was in his arms with her head against his chest. He felt like a furnace next to her frozen body. Now that she could feel herself breathing, she could also sense the breathing of the man, slow and even. A new shock of alarm shot through her veins. What kind of man is this? And where is he taking me? Suddenly she wasn't so sure being lost and forsaken was all that bad. Unless he really would help her. Country folk are always friendly, right? Daphne continued to hope as the man balanced her on a lifted knee so one of his hands could open the wooden door of a cabin. He pushed the door open with his foot and carried her across the threshold and then down a few stairs. A newer sense of warmth and light swirled all around her as her stinging eyes strained to see her surroundings through her ice-covered goggles. With one clumsy effort, Daphne attempted to pry the wretched things off her face. The man gently put her down on a padded bench and promptly took them off for her. Then he stepped aside to close the door. Daphne sighed in relief since she no longer felt the wind in her ears. Trying to be discreet, she glanced at her surroundings and discovered she was in a very small mudroom. She assumed they had come in the back entrance. A large moose head was mounted on the wall directly in front of her. Adjacent to the door they had just entered was another open door on her right. Daphne could see a washing machine in there. To her left, she saw nothing but an entrance to a hallway that ran parallel to her. Instinctively, Daphne knew this cabin was larger and more modern than she had expected. She groaned at the possibility of more strangers. I bet you want to warm up, the man presumed, turning to face her. However, the only thing that registered in Daphne's ears was the man's thick Texas twang. Daphne moved to nod, but wasn't certain she had succeeded. I'll take that as a yes, the man said. He walked past her and poked his head around the corner into the hallway. It looks like the bathroom is in okay shape. He turned to face her again without moving his stance. Feel free to take a hot bath or whatever you need. A hot bath? Oh, to be in one of those again. Daphne told her lips to say thank you, but she didn't hear a sound. She tried again, but her frozen chin was unable to move a single muscle. The man pursed his lips. Seeing him in the light, Daphne noticed for the first time he had red hair. It didn't detract from his face, however. In fact, it complemented it quite nicely. Can I help you with your coat or anything?" he asked, as he moved towards Daphne. She flinched involuntarily. Well, at least now he knew she wasn't made of stone. The man's eyes bulged in surprise at her movement, and then an expression of sympathy crossed his face. "It's okay. I'm not insane or anything." He swallowed hard, looking a little embarrassed. What I mean is, you can trust me." Daphne sniffed. Just because he said those words didn't make it so. The man slowly moved closer to her and helped her stand. Daphne now realized she was just 3 or 4 inches shorter than he. He couldn't be more than 5 feet 10 inches. For some reason, she found this surprising. She had imagined him to be taller, considering how strong he was. She studied him a little further and decided he must be somewhere in his mid-20s. If Laurel were here, she would be all over him. And then an impulsive panic seized Daphne's heart. "Laurel!" she gasped out loud. "What?" the Texan asked, looking startled. "My best friend is still out there!" she cried. The man put his hands on either side of Daphne's arms and looked directly at her, as if he were deciphering something difficult. "Say that again," he said. Daphne spoke slow and deliberate. "My best friend is still out there." The man's eyes bulged, and he cursed under his breath. "Does she have a cell phone with her?" he asked. "Yes!" Daphne exclaimed. For the first time, she was grateful Laurel never left her cyber friends behind. The man quickly disappeared without a word. Not moments later, he was back with the phone in hand. "You're in luck," he declared. "Cell service returned a few hours ago, after being out for a week." Daphne reached for the phone, but was unable to grasp it with her gloved hand. The man took the phone back and said, "What's the number?" Daphne barely noticed as he pulled off her glove and placed the phone back in her naked hand. Before Daphne could even register a dial tone, Laurel had answered on the other end. "Hello?" Laurel said in a hurried voice. Instant relief flooded through Daphne at the sound of her friend's voice. "Laurel?" Daphne replied. She moved her jaw up and down as she began to feel her nerves tingle. "Oh, Daphne, where are you? Are you okay?" Laurel inquired, sounding anxious. "Yeah, I'm fine. A guy found me and brought me to his cabin. What about you?" "Oh, I'm good. I made it to the highway. I called Brian and he picked me up. We've been driving back and forth trying to spot you." "Where is the cabin?" "I have no idea. Don't risk coming after me. I'm sure the man will help me get back after the blizzard is over." Daphne glanced up at her host, silently asking for this favor. He nodded in return. "Okay then, I'm so glad you're safe." "You too. Bye, Laurel." "Bye." Daphne ended the call and handed the phone back to the stranger, whom she was trusting with her life. "Is she okay?" he asked. "Yes, thank goodness." "Why don't you take off your snow gear and I will start running some hot water in the tub? You really should warm up." He didn't wait for her to respond, but just walked out of the mudroom and around the corner to where she assumed the bathroom was. The warm cabin was slowly bringing back her senses, and it hurt. Her fingers and toes tingled with pain. Her face felt raw and withered under her thick fleece ski mask. Her ears were still numb, and she was instantly aware her heart, which an hour or so ago she thought would stop from the chill, was now beating rapidly. This was too frightening. However, it was also too wonderful. The fact that she had seen the light from the cabin and then had actually seen the man outside was a direct answer to her prayers. Even though it was a little terrifying to be with this stranger, she would not give up on this miracle. She moved to unzip her coat, but was clumsy with the zipper. She pulled off her second glove and examined her hands. They were so painfully dry they were bleeding through cracks in her skin. With a trembling effort, she finally managed to maneuver the zipper. She looked up, and the red-headed man was by her side again, assisting her in taking her arms out of her coat. He hung it up on a hook near the door. Daphne leaned over to take off her boots. After a couple of futile yanks and heaves, she slumped against the wall to catch her breath. "Let me help," said the man, as he crouched in front of her and began to unbuckle her ski boots. Daphne realized she liked this man's voice quite a lot. It had a pleasant deep pitch, almost lyrical, with no hint of self-importance. Daphne smiled to herself. A southerner, no doubt. Amidst Daphne's speculations, she was now aware the southerner had also unzipped her snow pants and was sliding her legs out of them as well. "Do you have any, clothes under these?" he inquired, looking up at her cautiously. "I have long johns on, if that's what you mean," said Daphne. Her voice sounded dry, crackly, strange. The man raised his eyebrows. "Yeah, that's what I meant." Before she knew it, the man was helping her peel out of the rest of her clothes, right down to her long johns. Without notice, he picked her up and carried her to the bathroom. As awkward as this was, Daphne was grateful not to have to put weight on her injured leg again. The pain of it was beginning to increase much faster than her thawing body. The man gently set her down on her feet, and Daphne leaned her back against the tiled counter, supporting herself with her hands. You'll be okay now?" he asked, looking worried. Daphne nodded. "I'll manage," she muttered, although she was certain she couldn't, since she could barely move her muscles, even with his assistance. "Oh, we forgot this," the man said as he reached to take off Daphne's ski mask. "No!" Daphne snapped, batting his hand away. Fortunately, she was with it enough to refuse that offer. No way would she allow him to see her face right now. This situation was already embarrassing enough. The man staggered and took a step back with his hands up in surrender. She frowned under the fleece. "I'm sorry," she mumbled. "I'll manage." Wow, strange girl. But then again, if he had just been lost in the darkness, on a vast, dangerous mountain for who knows how long, fainted, and then found himself in the arms of a stranger who had just helped him undress, he would probably be a little on edge too. Tom hoped the girl wouldn't get too sick while she was here. He made his way to the kitchen to make some hot soup. She would need something to eat. He already had leftover cooked potatoes and chicken. While he was slicing some carrots, he heard a sob come from the bathroom. Poor thing. I wonder why she's out here. Well, whoever she was, he was glad to have someone else with him in the cabin. Yesterday, loneliness had overwhelmed him so much he had almost hugged his most recent moose kill. Although he would never admit this to the girl, he was secretly glad she would have to spend some extra time with him. Considering how much snow was coming down, there was no way that girl could go anywhere, and there was no way any rescue team could come in either. For who knew how long? Tom smiled to himself as he recalled how lovely his visitor had looked in her long johns. I bet she has a pretty face, too. He began whistling a nameless tune as he dropped some vegetables into the simmering broth. He had company. And that is the end of Chapter 1, On the Edge. I hope you liked it. I hope you come back next week for Chapter 2, which is called Red in the Face. If you want to find out more about Brenda's books, you can visit brendasbooks.net. Until next time, take care.